Hey everybody. So here in chapter 8, we're going to look at sort of the fallout in Asia, Europe, Africa a little bit after the fall of the Roman Empire. The heirs of Rome, Islam, Byzantium, and Europe. Um, and we will go through each one of these one at a time. We'll begin with Islam. We'll begin with this new religious faith. Islam began as a religion of city dwellers. Really began as this religion of city dwellers on the Arabian Peninsula. And eventually, it grows to include the Bedouin tribal societies, Bedouins, the nomadic Arab peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. There's loosely organized tribal societies. What the Bedouins did is they formed these few cities that had existed, very little political organization. They were accustomed to desert life. They were mostly either nomadic or pastoral, probably both, really combining them. Nomadic, obviously, meaning moving around from place to place. Pastoral, meaning they were herding. They usually herded animals, herded sheep, herded camels, for instance. And most of their revenue, most of their economics was based upon trade between different Bedouin tribes and again these handful of cities or raiding the trade routes between east and west that went across Asia. So this nomadic tribal way of life, often without written language, it sort of produced a very profound oral culture. Most things were transmitted orally, traditions, religious views, things like this. Mecca was one of these major towns. It was near the Red Sea on the peninsula, played a very important religious role because it was a center of local religions. And it should be made clear that up until the time of Islam, Arabian Peninsula was just like the rest of the world with many different religious faiths. It was pagan, uh, very similar. It's like Roman and Greek society worshiping many, many gods. And so Mecca was known as a holy place where there were multiple shrines to multiple different gods, a sacred location. Also, there was the Kaaba, which was the shrine, which served as a sacred place. It was also in Mecca. It was a location of neutrality. The Bedouin peoples were pretty warlike, but in Mecca and one of these religious sacred towns, there was to be no war violence. It was only for trade and commerce. The tribe that controlled the shrine at the time of Muhammad, founder of Islam, was the Quraysh. The Quraysh was the tribe who controlled it. They often benefited from it financially. It was a tourist industry, simply put, and they benefit from the tourism, from the movements of the people, lodging, food, transportation, trade, selling them products and goods. It made Mecca quite a large town and also quite wealthy. It had a significant upper class, merchant class that benefited from its status as a religious site and also the neutrality that existed there. Pilgrims would come there, often feeling safe at these sacred grounds. Um, it was simply a safe place and a neutral place, and very popular and well known through the Arabian Peninsula. Into all this, we introduce Muhammad. Muhammad lived from 570 to 632. He was born in Mecca. He was orphaned at a young age and eventually came under the care of his uncle. His uncle was a leader, a wealthy man in the Quraysh tribe, and had pretty high status. He himself grows up, becomes a merchant, a trader, and he marries Khadijah. Khadijah was a wealthy widow. Through the tradition of the time, when he married her, he would then inherit and take over her wealth. So he marries her, he starts running his own merchant and trade, and has basically takes over the business. This goes on for several years. Eventually, for some reason, Muhammad starts leaving the business and starts going off on his own and doing meditations. He starts sitting on his own. He would spend days awake from home, weeks eventually, meditating out in the open. Then eventually he moves to a cave and he starts sitting in a cave, meditating and praying. Um, then around 610, Muhammad starts hearing voices. He starts hearing no one else can hear these, but he starts hearing these voices and these visions call him to worship God, what he calls Allah. This is the same God of the Jewish faith, Judaism, and Christian. It's the same God, goes by a different name. He heard these, he said he was speaking to the angel Gabriel, that the angel Gabriel was speaking to him in the cave and communicating these messages directly from God. And this word God, Allah, meaning God in Arabic, he accepted this. He accepted himself as a prophet of God, that he was actually hearing the words from God or from God's intermediary, and that he was supposed to spread the word of God in his version. Over several years, he receives these messages and he comes to believe he is actually getting messages directly from God. He commits them to memory, and as was the tradition back then, everything was transmitted orally. And so he committed all these messages to memory, and he began preaching the scripture as transmitted by God. The messages these are eventually recorded, written down, and this becomes the holy book of Islam, the Quran. And Quran means recitation. Basically, it's the words of God as transmitted through Muhammad, put down on paper. The Quran becomes the basis of everything in the society. The Quran is the basis. It is a history book. It's the prophecy, the words of God, the prophecy of the message of the scripture, and also a legal and moral code, which both men and women should live by. It also emphasizes a nuclear family, a family of a husband, wife, and children. Now, over time, Muslim society comes to, as we will call it, this Muslim society, comes to entirely manifest itself as a mirror image of the Quran. Muslim society, political, religious, is to be a reflection of the writings in the Quran. Islam replaces individuality. Islam replaces this violence and warfare and this constant competition between Muslim tribes, which we'll now call, I guess, Arab tribes, would be the better way to say, but they eventually become all Islamic. And this idea of Islam replaces all the factionalism, the violence, and the competition with the idea that we are all Arab people are part of the same society, the same community, the Ummah, this community of believers, community of followers of Muhammad and followers of Allah, where everyone should, the term we would use in Christianity is Orthodox. So this becomes the Orthodox faith in the Arabian Peninsula within just a few decades. This is the fastest spreading religion in history. Um, so in just a matter of years, this becomes the orthodox, meaning the established, the standard religion across the entire Arabian Peninsula and eventually across pretty much the entire Arab world. Um, Islam has no priests. There is there's no intermediaries. There's no liturgy. Um, there is nothing. In essence, Islam, there is no intermediary in Islam. Uh, Really, every individual, it's based upon individual faith, individual adherence, and every individual's direct connection to Allah. This is an image, picture from the script, from the Quran. Different than most holy books. It is actually believed to be the actual words of God. As translated through Muhammad, the actual words of God translated through Muhammad or through the angel Gabriel through Muhammad. Most of it was written down after he died. This is actually the case with almost all faiths. Almost all major religious faiths are written down after, written down after Jesus, written down after Buddha, written down after Muhammad. They're all written down afterwards, after they pass. He died in 632. And this is the Quran. It's prohibited in the Quran to actually translate in other languages. Obviously, yes, you can find it in other languages on the internet. You can find probably books, but it's technically prohibited to ever translate it outside of Arabic, actually, according to the Quran itself. So we see the growth of Islam. As I mentioned just a moment ago, it becomes the fastest growing faith in world history. In less than a century, in less than 100 years, Islam has spread across an area twice the size of the Roman Empire. And it isn't just spread, it's basically taken over all these regions. It was incredibly fast moving. Muhammad found his first convert and his wife, his friends, family. Khadijah, wife, and the family were his first converts. But eventually, his preaching to people in Mecca and other communities, he spreads the faith rather quickly before his death. He insists that all other types of polytheistic cults, multi god, or what we commonly call pagan, any other type of multi god faith, polytheistic, must end. There is only one God, Allah. You can only worship the one God. All others must be abolished, abandoned. Um, Problematic in Mecca. Mecca had created itself as a polytheistic safe place for people of multiple religious faiths and different ideologies to be able to come safely and trade and barter. So the ruling class elite in Mecca were incredibly resistant to what Muhammad was telling them was basically you're going to have to stop. Everything you've done to make profit and wealth, all of your trade, all of your, as I said, it was almost like a tourist attraction. All that has to stop. Now there's just one faith, and everyone must follow the one faith without exception. Everyone is required to be Islamic. Mecca resisted this, and eventually they actually kick him out. They threaten him. He leaves. He flees Mecca. Around 622. This is called the Hijra. And the Hijra is this journey from Mecca to Medina, traveling to Medina. This marks year one of the Muslim calendar. If you are unaware of that, in Islam, people who follow the Islamic calendar, this would only be what the year 1400 or something, around that approximately. This is the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Um, so this marks the beginning of it, the Hijra. At Medina, he finds many followers. Medina is more open and accepting to him. He finds many people willing to listen. And in just a few years, he becomes a leader in Medina. In essence, he doesn't take over the town militarily, but socio-culturally, he comes to dominate the town as the prophet of God of this brand new faith. And this faith, one of the things that we'll talk about that makes it so successful is this faith is about bringing everybody together to stop the competition, the violence, to stop the constant um, factionalism, which had been so common in the Arabian Peninsula of all the different tribes, all the different faiths. He wants to bring everyone together and put everybody on the same page, if you will, metaphorically. He gets these followers. His political position in Medina sets the pattern. This sets the pattern to which Islam will follow moving forward. My mouse is kind of weird. My little thing is kind of funky here. He sets this pattern moving forward, which Islamic society would come to be governed. Rather than adding a church to political and cultural life, what we find is that political and religious institutions become the same. In Christian society, in most Christian societies, the church and the state are separate nominally. Truly separate, often no. But there's a king. For instance, in Catholic faith, there's a king and there's a pope. There's an emperor and there's a pope. So you have a secular side, which is the governing, the secular with the king or emperor, and then you have the religious side, which is the pope or the priests and the bishops. What happens in Islam is those come to be intertwined, to where the political and the religious come to govern together. They are one and the same. It's interesting, and it is different than we see in Christianity, for instance. Around 624, Muhammad starts his aggression. It should definitely be noted that Islam they were warrior people. The Bedouins were warrior tribes, and they start using military tactics to come to dominate their neighbors. 624, Muhammad leads an ambush on a Mecca caravan. This becomes known as the Battle of Badr, where he killed about 50 Meccans, took prisoners, confiscated their goods. um, we're not going to use slaves yet. Islamic society does use slaves. All societies in this time period use slaves. It's common. They do as well. I don't know if we would call it slaves at this point, but they took them as prisoners. They confiscated a lot of treasure. This event, it sort of transforms traditional idea. No longer is this about, because remember, very traditional Bedouin society was raiding merchant caravans and the what we call the Silk routes, which were all the trade routes between China going over to Europe. So from Asia all the way over to Europe and Africa, this was one of their sources of wealth, was raiding these trade routes from the civilizations, Rome and Persia and the Sassanids and the Byzantines, all these great empires that were super powerful. The barbarian raiders, whether they were Germanic barbarians or Bedouin barbarians, they would raid these trade lines. Well, he now shifts it, and it takes this idea of plundering to actually make it a Muslim virtue, known as jihad, to actually meaning striving or holy war, to actually take from the more powerful. This isn't exactly Robin Hood, but it's sort of the same idea. The idea of taking treasure and power, because Meccans were wealthy. Mecca was probably the richest city in the Arabian Peninsula due to the things I've already mentioned. So it was the idea of taking power from the rich and wealthy and giving it more to the people. So it is sort of an idea of what we would think of as this Robin Hood ideal. Certainly involved a lot of death and a lot of violence, but that was something the Bedouins were used to. This was normal life, as it was probably everywhere back then. I mean, look how the Germanic peoples were in Europe. They were constantly fighting and killing each other. So this is honestly nothing unusual. This is nothing different than what the Christians were doing either, or Indians or Chinese. I mean, we've talked about all these cultures. War was just common practice. He gains lots of adherents, and he actually consolidates his power as a base in Medina. Medina becomes his power base. Most Jews did not convert. Jews didn't convert to Christianity. Jews didn't convert to Islam. Uh, Rarely do Jewish people convert to other faiths, ever. So, due to the fact that they're unwilling to convert, there was also some belief that Jewish people were still supporting other tribes. They were still supporting Mecca. Because they themselves were often merchants and traders. They were often people who survived on business ventures. So for them, religion, obviously their faith was important, but for them, their economic livelihood was based upon the caravans, for instance. Muhammad actually kicks out all of the Jews. He expels all the Jews from Medina, executes or enslaves them. Relations between Jews and Muslims gets better over the years, but initially Muhammad identified Jews as the enemy. So did the Christians. The Christians often did similar things to the Jews as well. Christian emperors were known to execute Jews by the hundreds or thousands. So this again is nothing different than what the Christians were doing. He instituted new practices that defined Islam as a unique religion, and we usually identify these as the five pillars of Islam, which made this a unique and different religious faith than any other religious faith. These practices include taxes on any type of goods you had. This is known as alms. You're required to pay a tax on goods, on your possessions. You were supposed to fast during the month of Ramadan, which is the ninth month of the Islamic year. You were supposed to fast during, I believe it was the daylight hours. Don't quote me on that, but I think during the daylight hours you were supposed to fast. The Hajj, this was the pilgrimage that every Muslim is supposed to make in their lifetime. If possible, no matter where you live, you're supposed to make this pilgrimage to Mecca, to the Kaaba. I'm looking at my notes. I don't have the details on that, but I believe that is correct. It was to make it to Mecca, to the Kaaba. Um, this pilgrimage to Mecca. At the time, it was yearly. You were supposed to go every year. But this, of course, is when everybody lived on the Arabian Peninsula, and you could, take out a couple weeks and make this pilgrimage potentially. Today, I believe the standard acceptance in Islamic practice is at least once in your lifetime. Since people live globally, you are to make the pilgrimage and make the trip to Mecca. You should do that. Salat is the formal worship, which is 3 times a day in this time period. You're supposed to worship 3 times a day. You're supposed to face Mecca, face the Kaaba, and worship 3 times a day. And then also, you're also supposed to regularly recite the Shahada, which is your profession of faith. You're supposed to give your profession of faith to Allah and to Islam, the Shahada. Um, Muhammad also had Muslims. At prayer, you were supposed to physically turn away from Jerusalem, and this is where the tradition comes to where you're supposed to face Mecca. The idea was to turn away from Jerusalem, which was a Jewish. Jews, there really weren't many Christians in the Arabian Peninsula. Would have been very, very few. So the other religious enemy, because most other Bedouin tribes, other religious faiths converted over, and the only real holdout on the Arabian Peninsula were the Jews. Every other religious faith either gave up their ideas or allowed themselves to be absorbed into Islam, but not the Jews. So this idea of facing the Kaaba and facing Mecca specifically comes out of this distrust and hatred of the Jews, turn away from Jerusalem and face Mecca. That is now, because it should be understood that Muslims also consider Jerusalem a holy place. It's also a holy site, but Mecca is more holy. The Kaaba is ranks above that. Therefore, you must always face the Kaaba instead, even though Jerusalem is still, again, this was considered to be the same God. Muslims consider this to be the same God as the Jewish and the Christian faith. It's just I think the best way to look at it is they accepted that Jesus and Abraham were both prophets of God. They just believed Muhammad was the correct prophet of God. Muhammad got it right. Basically, Jesus and Abraham got it wrong. Muhammad is the one who finally figured it out correctly. And therefore, it is the new improved version of the faith in God, and it is the proper faith in God. In 630, Muhammad and followers, thousands of followers, they march into Mecca and they take over the city. They take over the city. His prestige, he's basically leading an army now. He's a warlord. He has an entire army now. He's convinced many people to convert, and he dies about 2 years later. By the time he dies, he's already converted and united about half the Arabian Peninsula. Maybe a third of the Arabian Peninsula. He's already united and combined under the banner of Islam. Women in Islam. Initially, Islam approved, I say this differently. Initially, Islam improved the status of women. Actually gave women more authority initially. They removed the practice of infanticide. Infanticide is where they would actually kill the girls because they didn't want girls, they wanted boys. Boys to be merchants, boys to be warriors, boys to continue on the bloodline. This was important to them. They wanted boys. So killing girls, the baby girls, was common practice. Polygamy still happens, which means having multiple spouses, multiple wives. I believe multiple wives. Yeah, I believe it's, or is it multiple husbands? Maybe polygamy. Don't quote me on that. Maybe that's just having multiple spouses in general. Still practiced. Men were supposed to treat all of their wives fairly and equally. Everyone was supposed to have a dowry, where the husband was supposed to provide for his daughters, if he had daughters, to give them a dowry, and they had inheritance rights. In the beginning, women probably had more equality and fair treatment under Islam than they had under the traditional Bedouin society. However, within the next 200 years, we find that women began to be separated and segregated from men, and their position reverts to the traditional patriarchal, male-led, male-dominated women to be subservient and obedient, which is actually more in line with how most societies were in this time period. So, if anything, when Islam began, it was actually an outlier, giving women more equality and fair treatment, and then it reverted back to what most societies treated women as back again as second class people to be oppressed or exploited. The Arab men continue to be warriors. Muslims, very important. God's injunction was to strive against all unbelievers. In other words, convert everybody. This was their form of jihad. It didn't have to be violent unless you resisted. Everyone was to convert over. This was the only true faith. And eventually, the goal of Islam at the time was nothing less to convert everybody to the Islamic faith. After Muhammad's death, he had, well, just right prior to his death, he had reorganized Arab society as a military religious state. That was simply the way it was. It was a military religious state focused on jihad of neighbors, to get all neighbors to convert, to bring all Arab peoples together under one banner. His successors, the ones that take over, the leaders who take over, we start to call them the caliphs. The king, war chief, it depends on the situation, but basically these were the military political leaders who took over after his death. They regularly attacked the Romans, they regularly attacked the Persians, or let's see, in this time period, would it be the Persians? It might be the Sassanid Empire, maybe. Regularly attacked Byzantine, Persian, and, well, that's the Roman world. Byzantines consider themselves the Romans. So this was common, this war and conquest. To the east, they eventually do bring down the Sassanids in 651. They collapse the Sassanid Empire. That was what was pretty much the leftover after. No, I'm going to backtrack and not say that. I could be wrong on that. So the Sassanid Empire does eventually collapse under constant onslaught from the Muslims. During the 7th and 8th century, well, let's just say by 750, the time you see here on the side, by 750, Muslim forces controlled almost everything from Spain to India, with the exception of Europe, the core of Europe itself, and they even controlled parts of Europe. Again, Spain, that was Europe. Southeast Europe, what we think of as the Balkans region, all that was under Islamic control. Greece was probably Byzantium at this point in time, but soon Greece actually, I mean, eventually Greece will fall under Muslim control as well later, uh, all the way over to India. And what, 120-year period of time, Islam came to dominate an area bigger than the Roman Empire. And not like Christian Europe, even though Europe might have been thought of as Christian, most Europeans were not Christian, even if the rulership and the authority was Christian. Not so with Islam. Almost everyone converted. Almost everyone actually did convert. Now, the Arabs owe the success of conquest really to the weakened state. Byzantium was weakened, fall of the Roman Empire. Byzantium was constantly being attacked from the north, the south, the east, the west. The barbarians, the Huns, the Avars, the Vandals, those are all European and Northern African tribes, constantly attacking the Byzantines, including the Persians themselves. Well, the Byzantines fought back and they attacked. Anyway, so Persia and Byzantium were weak, and so this really exhausted them. And this often allowed the Muslims, who were now sort of a super tribe, inspired by religious fervor, inspired by jihad, it allowed them to use their skills as warriors, as these Bedouin warriors, against the unbelievers. And frankly, they kicked ass. They dominated everywhere they went. They were already had the skills and the technology as being the horse warriors. They had learned skills, technology, weapons, metallurgy from other empires, and they became an empire. They became a Muslim empire. Um, discontented Christians and Jews in both Byzantium and Persian territories often welcomed Muslims. Often welcomed Muslims. After the time of Muhammad, Islam shifted and allowed people to actually, they preferred everyone to convert, but it wasn't, how to say it differently, how to say it better. When they took over a territory, the leadership had to convert. The authority, the leadership of the territory, the aristocracy, if you will, the upper classes had to convert. But the people, the regular populace, as long as they accepted Islamic rulership and Islamic authority and followed Islamic laws, they could continue to worship their faiths as Christians or Jews. They were okay with that. They had to pay a tax. They had to pay a head tax. As long as they paid the tax, mostly they left them alone. Um, Many of the territories they were now conquering were not Bedouin, were not Arab. India, Europe, Africa. They were conquering many places that had an entirely different socio-cultural norm than Bedouin society. So it seems like the Islamic peoples, these caliphs, just didn't feel as threatened by these other faiths. They felt very strong in their faith. Again, the Arabian Peninsula was Muslim. Most of Middle East was Muslim. So they were much easier getting along with these other peoples as long as they paid their tax and they obeyed the rules. They were okay. And warfare and violence and persecution were common in Byzantium and Persia, for instance. So they welcomed the Muslims which came in, which actually turned out to be very often the Islamic peoples were, once they conquered, peace actually reigned in Islamic territories for long periods of time, usually longer than you saw in Persia or Byzantium. It's interesting. Um, we do have this crisis of succession, though, after his death. There was a lot of confusion about who would actually rule after Muhammad died. It was not clearly laid out. The first caliphs who ruled after Muhammad died were simply his lead generals, his most influential, powerful men. They took over. And a couple of influential families took over. Umayyad family, for one. The first two caliphs who ruled after Muhammad were from the Umayyad. The third caliph was Uthman. The third caliph was Uthman, who ruled from 44 to 56. He was the son-in-law to Muhammad. He had a lot of problems, though. He was criticized a lot. They believe he only got his position as caliph not due to his warrior status or his authority, but simply because he was technically related, son-in-law of Muhammad. So that was the only reason he got his authority, was due to family relations. I forget what we call that today. Nepotism, is that right? Um, and they thought he didn't deserve the position. So this actually starts a split. This actually starts a split in this Islamic faith. One of his rivals was Ali. Ali was of the Hashim family. So Ali actually splits and says, no, he should be the true leader. And if we actually look at the tradition of warrior leaders in Islamic faith from Muhammad and the following caliphs, Ali would have been the more appropriate leader. Nonetheless, Uthman took over and claimed leadership. Many people followed Uthman. Many people choose to follow Ali. And we get this split. Eventually, a group of soldiers actually murder Uthman. Civil war breaks out between the two factions. Ali himself is then murdered. So the people who murdered Uthman might have been working for Ali, but then they turn around and murder Ali. So both of the two leaders of the two different, the factionism between the two, murder off each other. Um, Again, not uncommon. These were warrior peoples. So this is actually a common. I mean, you look at European tribes, European barbarian tribes, they often killed each other. So this is not something unusual. Eventually, after the Ali is killed, the Umayyad stays in power. The Umayyad Caliph stay in power till about 750. This faction that supported Ali were known as the Shi'at Ali. The Shi'at Ali, which translates as Ali's faction, which we usually refer to them as maybe it's a more abbreviated form. And again, I don't know exactly the terminology, but we often say we call the Shiites. These are the followers of Ali. They continue to avoid the caliphs, believing the caliphs that are running the Umayyad caliphs are really not the actual real authority. And these mainstream Muslims, and I'm putting that in quotes, who follow the Umayyad dynasty, end up calling themselves or get called the Sunni. These are still the two major divisions today. The Sunni and the Shiite are still the two major divisions in Muslim faith today, and they kill each other. Again, also not unusual. Not unusual for different Christian sects and different Christian beliefs to actually go to war with each other. This was a common thing between Christian Catholic Europe and Eastern Orthodox Byzantium. They went to war with each other. So we have these two faiths separating and going to war and fighting each other. This gives you an idea of the world we're talking about at the time, map of this expansion. We have Medina and Mecca, the Battle of Badr right there. Persia. This is the Byzantine Empire right through here. So the Byzantines constantly fighting the Persians, and eventually Islam beginning here, spreading in northern Africa, spreading all through what today we refer to as the Middle East. And all this region here, remember, all this was Roman. At one point, all of this was Roman Empire. Christian. Muslims take it over, dominate it. They move into Persia, and again, Indus. That's India right there. So they start to make their way towards India, and eventually even conquering parts of India. You can see all this grayish area here. That's the expansion under the Umayyads to 750. So by 750, 2/3 of this entire map is Muslim. That doesn't mean every person's Muslim, but it's all governed by Muslim religious faith, ideology, and politics. Remember, this is politics and religion are together. These are religious states combined in this area. And the only thing not under Muslim faith on this map, really, this is all desert here. And then up here, this is Byzantium. And then up here, we start having a few Christian kingdoms arise. The Frankish kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire, things like that start to arise. It is the fastest spreading faith in history, and it's pretty impressive how quickly it moves. But once Islam comes in, even if it violently rushes in, once Islam comes in, peace seems to reign in these places at a higher level than you usually saw in other empires. It's very ironic that these Islamic warriors often brought peace and prosperity. They believed that Christians, again, after Muhammad, we really see that Islamic faith comes to accept Christians as people of the book. The idea being that they are also of the same God. So they start to have greater religious tolerance and acceptance of Christians and Jews. As long as you accept Muslim authority and Muslim rules, you can continue to worship your own faiths. Allowing them to work and worship, they had to pay this tax. They had to pay a head tax. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, for instance, from 661 to 750, the Muslim world became a solid empire. For a very short period of time, probably the largest empire in the world, rivaling Rome or China, anything. It was massive. Almost that entire map was one solid empire by 750 under the Umayyad Caliphate, which would have been the Umayyad empire of the Umayyads. It all falls apart after 750. They all still remain Muslim, but it still falls apart. They borrow the institutions of those they conquered. They issue coins. They hire local peoples to rule, local peoples to govern in these different regions and territories. They hire Byzantines, Persians. They hire all the local population to continue to rule, as long as they all accept that the Islamic authority of the Umayyads. The capital of the Umayyad Caliphate was Damascus. That is in the Arabian Peninsula, I believe. Damascus in the Arabian Peninsula. There's Damascus right there, right close to modern day Israel, right there, Damascus. So accept that the standard language is Arabic for all types of government or trade. Arabic. That doesn't mean everybody has to know it. Again, you don't have to convert over or use Arabic, but if you want to be involved in business or government, trade, you have to learn Arabic. Brings everyone together as a united linguistically under the same language. They start writing everything down. They start writing down all the literature. They start writing down all of what we start calling the hadith. This is basically religious literature. The idea of all the religious teachings, not the Quran, but all the ideas, the literature, the teachings, these different stories and narratives. It would, if it wasn't, it would almost be like a storybook, like a fiction book. Except it isn't fiction; it's actually of the faith. It's considered it's faith. It's nonfiction, but there are a bunch of stories. The Bible has similar things. The Bible has similar things with different, like basically stories and tales, which have moral purposes. So there's similarities there to this Hadith literature. Um, it does often focus about Muhammad, though. The Hadith literature often talks about Muhammad and his life, and he was the shining example of what it was to be. I don't know if they would use the term perfect, but in other words, he was the example all other Muslims should adhere to or strive to follow this. Um, art, calligraphy, prose, poetry. Calligraphy, which I don't know, no one really studies calligraphy anymore if you're not an art student, I suppose. When I was in school, we actually learned calligraphy. When I was in elementary school, we learned how to write, we write cursive and learn how to write calligraphy. Calligraphy becomes an art, and we see a new literate, educated upper class among the elite in the Islamic society across Europe, Asia, Africa. They often did writing, prose, writing, which is official documents, poetry, on hunting, on fishing, on love. Um, poetry found to be a very important medium for propaganda. We actually start to find most of the poetry coming out of the Islamic world is really based upon moralistic of what moral or idealistic ideas of what it is to be a good Muslim, to be a good person in the Islamic world. Poetry that really represent what it was to be a good person, faithful to God. So even this poetry isn't exactly religious poetry, but we also wouldn't call it secular either. There's certainly a religious aspect to most of this poetry. It was used to promote the empire, to promote the glory and the authority of the Muslim people. Not uncommon. Roman emperors did this. Roman emperors had books written and stories written and plays written that promoted them as descended from gods. I mean, Augustus did stuff like this. I mean, this is not something that was unusual in other places as well. They use stories of courage, religious observance, love, and sex. Yes, they did have stories of sex, stories that were kind of, I don't know, explicit. Yeah, I mean, that's a good word to use. This was scandalous. You weren't really supposed to write about anything that had any type of crossover between religion and sex. Sex had the purpose really, among for most Muslims, sex really was a purpose of procreation. But we do see it. It does exist. Maybe it wouldn't have been commonly accepted, but it was there. I guess the bottom line is anything you could think of would be written in Arabic in the Muslim communities, just like it was anywhere else. Um, this does become probably the most prosperous and the most advanced society by 750, with maybe the exception of Constantinople itself. And I'm not even going to say Byzantium, not even the whole Byzantine Empire, just Constantinople. Other than that city, this probably becomes the most prosperous and advanced culturally, economically, and even technologically community in the world, probably. They become a shining example of peace, prosperity, and education for all other peoples, whether east, west, south, north, doesn't really matter. Civilization by the end of the Umayyad period in 750 was multi ethnic, urban, sophisticated, and yeah, on its way, it does become the most advanced society on earth by over the next couple centuries. As Europe is going through the Dark Ages, Islamic culture and society just continues to elevate itself and really comes to dominate the old world. Beautiful. This is the Dome of the Rock at Jerusalem, built in 691. Beautiful structure. Beautiful structure. This was built during the Umayyad Caliphate. It's the oldest Islamic architecture that exists in the world. Just about the only Islamic architecture still standing, original, still standing from the same century as Muhammad. Almost nothing still stands from that time period. This had been a Jewish temple. This was built on top of the Jewish temple. You can see very characteristic artwork here, scroll work, this artwork of in Arabic. You can also see these arches, which you will see these in all type of mosques and all type of Arabic structures. These typical this arch form we have here. This is according to the theology of Islam, the place where God created man. It's also where Abraham, who was the traditional father of the Jewish faith, attempted or agreed to sacrifice his son to God. And God, of course, stopped him at the last moment, saying, "Well, you've truly proved your faith." And again, Jesus and Abraham were considered holy and significant in the Islamic faith. Okay, so now we're going to look at Byzantium. Byzantium from 570 to 750. From the 3rd to the 6th century, Byzantium was constantly at war. The first major challenge came from the Sassanids, which was Persia, the modern Persia. This began to focus Persia began to focus attention on the western half of Mesopotamia, which was near the Byzantine border, collected land taxes, and eventually turning Persia, Sassanid Empire, into a major trading center. The Sassanids invaded Byzantium in 603, conquering lands in Asia and Africa. And pretty much from 603 to the fall of the Sassanid Empire, we see constant warfare between the two empires. However, it made both empires very susceptible to outside attackers, outside aggressors, the Lombards, the Slavs, the Avars, the Bulgars, the Huns, the Xiongnu. Those are probably the Huns, the same thing, really. Uh, and lots of other groups. And eventually, of course, the Muslims as well. Dealing with constant migrations from the Lombards from Italy, the Balkan regions, which is what we normally would think of as southeastern Europe, constant attacks. The Bulgars actually defeat the Byzantine army in 681, forcing Byzantium to recognize the Bulgars as an independent state, an independent sovereign territory. These territories, now that they're lost, they no longer serve the Byzantine Empire, which means they no longer serve for tax revenue. They no longer serve because the Byzantines, as the Romans had before them, often recruited from these provinces, these outside territories. So it also hurts their ability to raise armies, collect taxes. Certainly affects trade as well. Probably the largest amount of wealth that came into the Byzantine Empire was trade and trade revenue, taxes and whatnot. Now they were losing much of that. Cuts off trade and travel east-west. Remember, this is the Silk Roads. Byzantium sat right on the Silk Roads. It also widens the cultural, religious, and political gap between East and West. And when referring to Byzantium, East and West, we're talking about Europe and Byzantium. The old Roman Empire versus the new Roman Empire. And the Byzantines consider themselves Romans. Have no doubt they thought of themselves as the Roman Empire. But this East and West gap, cultural, religious gap. Not a lot of communication in the 7th century, constant warfare, constant violence. Um, we see the Western Roman Empire focusing on Latin and focusing on Europe, what was left of the empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire focuses on Greek. We see a big disinterest between the two, disinterested in how each other, excuse me, really the cultural, political interests of the two, East and West, really separate. And really, there was no Western Roman Empire. It was really Germanic tribes dominating Europe and Southern Europe. But the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, does continue on. You can see here the map, Ctesiphon, that is the capital, Byzantine Empire. In the 500s, Byzantium reconquers much of what had been Rome. And then look at where they are just 150 years later. So we're looking at, in the 500s, they reconquer much of what had been the Roman Empire, but then do the constant attacks and violence from the outsiders, including Persia, including the Muslims. By 700, this is the Byzantine Empire. Shrunk down to about 1/8 its size from the mid 500s, the time of Justinian and emperors following Justinian. So, yeah. Interestingly enough, even though the Byzantine Empire, I guess I should put it this way, the fact that the Byzantine Empire survives for another, what, 700 years is really due to the fact that it was so small. Had it maintained this massive size, well, it couldn't have. That was one of the factors that led to the fall of Rome. It was simply too big to govern and to protect. Had Byzantium tried to maintain this massive territory, it would have fallen for certain. But it does eventually constrict itself to essentially a small state, and that allows it to survive for, well, the better part of another millennia. From an urban to a rural way of life. By the 8th century, Byzantine Empire was quite small, conquered by the outsiders and conquered territory by the Muslims and all the other tribes. Uh, Basically, they're loyal subject in Egypt and Syria and Europe, all now pretty much lived under Arab rule. So, non-Muslims could practice their religions in peace as well in the Christian Empire. So, well, I guess let me say it differently. All of these people, I said that incorrectly. All the people that were now conquered by Islam and conquered by the Arabs could live peacefully, generally peacefully, once the conquering was over under the Muslim rulers. The most radical transformation for Byzantines probably was simply the size. As I said, by 700s, the empire shrunk down to almost an eighth of its original size. Constant pressure, invasions, things like this. We see most of the large cities disappear. Constantinople remains, but most of the large cities and territories really become rural. The focus of daily life moves from large scale trade and big business enterprise and empire building to simply maintaining a small state, to maintaining this small empire, to where pretty much all of the powers of the imperial dynasties of 1,000 years of Rome disappeared. And this became a small country surrounded by more dominant and bigger countries. Many cities were reduced to rubble by warfare, and even though they would have rebuilt cities in the ancient times, when there was massive amounts of wealth and power, now they simply leave them. And by the year 1000, the majority of people in Byzantium were farmers. It is really converted to a more of a rural way of life. The public baths empty out, the great waterways, the great water conduits, the aqueducts disappear or fall apart. They can't repair them any longer. The focus of daily life is simply church and local community and farms. Really changes. They still call themselves Romans. They're still the Roman Empire in their view, but they are a shadow of its former self. We do see a handful of cities still survive. Certainly, Constantinople does remain a thriving center of trade and commerce. Most other large cities just simply fade away. Long distance trade is very limited, other than a handful of more important luxury goods that do still travel through Constantinople. Agriculture becomes the focus of daily life. Now, in the West, where you had a rich and powerful elite controlling the agricultural economy, because in the Western world, which is Europe, it really becomes about kings and lords and big manors and estates, what we will eventually call feudal society, that really develops in the West. In the East, we see a lot more free and small independent farmers, not ruled by large estates and lords with knights running around like you see in all the ideas of the medieval ages. That is really Europe. Byzantine takes a little bit different route, really mostly focused on free peasants or semi-free peasants, growing food, herding cattle, vineyards, um, and primarily interacting with local communities, farms, and monasteries. It becomes less about large armies, which Europe is still marching large armies around, the Franks, for instance. Becomes less about empire building and state building, and Europe is still focused on that, and really more about adjusting to this new, more agrarian way of life, more focused on agriculture and small communities, other than the couple of small cities like Constantinople. Promotion of the nuclear family is very important. Husband, wife, and kids. Really more about farm and community. They still follow the legal traditions of Rome. Again, they still consider themselves Rome, Byzantine law really focuses on the family. We see limited amount of divorce. Marital infidelity is punished heavily, either male or female. Um, you are expected to be faithful and take care of your family, and women are given status. For a while, even though women are segregated, women are often kept separate. That tradition of wearing the full face veil that you most commonly today would see in Muslim society for very conservative Muslim communities, um, that actually started in Constantinople. That actually became a tradition there. It could be said sometimes Constantinople was a state unto itself. It was a world unto itself. The majority of people were born, lived, and died within the city walls. The people who lived there. Many people lived their entire life never stepping outside the walls of Constantinople. It was its own unique society, different than even the rest of the Byzantine Empire or Byzantine state at this point, really. New military and cultural forms. We'll talk about that. Byzantine military resiliency. So, with this new rural life taking precedence economically and culturally, it's not surprising that military, social, political changes really have accompanied this transformation. The Byzantine navy did fight successfully at sea. Remember, Constantinople surrounded by water, so they tried to create a comparable land force. They encouraged the development of these sort of middle class farmer soldiers, sort of like the classical Roman model of the farmer soldier. The way they did this was by promising land and low taxes to people who didn't have property, to basically the landless poor. Hey, we'll give you a farm, we'll give you low taxes, and then you serve in the military. And of course, while you're in the military, you will get paid, your family will do okay on the farm, and then when you retire from the military service, you are basically set. You have a farm, you have a home, you have a stable income, and you can pass that on to your heirs. So it was a way to help entice people to join the military with promises of essentially economic prosperity or social status, assuming you didn't die. Now, that doesn't mean the land didn't still stay in your family, but you did have to fulfill a military contract to get the land. So you had to live. You had to basically live. Um, if you were a landowner, though, this is pretty much you're taken care of by the state. If you're a landowner, though, you are expected to actually provide your own military weapons and horses and your own military supplies. So yeah, it was generally easier to get the poor to enlist than the middle class and above, who had to sort of take care of themselves. To counter all these attacks, the empire divided themselves into military districts. So you saw how the Roman Empire divided itself into dioceses, basically different governing districts. Well, in Byzantium, they developed a similar idea of themes. And these are the different military districts. In addition, all the different military matters, all the different government matters were put in the hands of a manager, sort of a manager, a strategoi, I guess. And the strategoi serves as a regional tax collector and is not exactly a governor because there might be a local governor, but this is sort of the empire's empire's associate in the different theme, the one who reports directly to the empire and manages the military functions of the different theme, even though there might actually be a local a governor of the particular region in addition. All right, we have new religious education as well. This allows people to education, as we'll find out both in Byzantium and in Europe. We'll talk about later. In this entire time period and for centuries, is pretty much controlled and implemented through the church. So if you received an education in this time period, it was usually in association with the church. It's interesting. We later on talk about all the classical education of Roman and Greek culture, yet in this time period, they actually move away from that. They move away from the classics, as we call it, of Roman and Greek society and culture and art, literature, all that, and they actually really focus on religious education. Now, that might have also been because in many places in the empire, those were the only really educated people. The upper class elite and the priests, part of the Christian church. Um, we had schools. It was common that they would start to build schools, these elementary type schools, that's what we would call them. Don't know what they called them. These elementary schools, and they often used the Bible to teach from. So the Bible was the school book. That was the curriculum, if it will. And they would spend time talking about the lives of saints. They would talk about the religious scriptures. So religious education was incredibly significant and important to this community. Now, if you wanted to be educated, then you had to go that route, generally speaking, unless you were rich and you could afford a private tutor. Secular training remains out of favor, and religious authority becomes, even though it is still technically separated religious and secular state, sacred and secular, religious education becomes very important because they're really the only ones who are focusing on religion or focusing on education. So it has to come through them. All right. So let's look at religion, politics, iconoclasm. Because the spiritual and secular realms were considered, even though they were separate, and we had an emperor and we had a leader of the church known as the patriarch, they were still considered tied together. In the Islamic world, they were intertwined. In the Christian Byzantine world, they were side by side. They were both generally equally powerful. Technically, basically just like my fingers here, technically the emperor was more powerful, just a slightly above the patriarch. But the patriarch was close. Both held very equal power, even if the emperor was technically above. Bishops were very important. That's another interesting thing about the Byzantine Empire. They would sometimes put regions of the empire, these different regional areas, these different provinces, actually under the control of church officials. Because in some of these areas, that's the only people they trusted. That's the only people the empire trusted were church officials who were supposedly beholden to the Christian church, which was based this half of the Christian church based in Constantinople. The emperor was the leader of the state. The emperor was also, even though the patriarch led the church, the patriarch technically reported to the emperor. So he was also the authority over the church as well. They appointed chief religious officials. This was the patriarch. He along with the patriarch controlled religious doctrine, church councils. So we have this three-tier system. Um, the patriarch and the emperor was sort of at the head of the system, at the top of the tier of different church officials. They would appoint metropolitans. Metropolitans were sort of the middle group. These metropolitans would control entire provinces, as I said, sort of religious leaders as well. And then, of course, you'd also have bishops. You'd have bishops in charge of different territories as well. So the church and state were side by side. They were tied together and they worked together, but there was a separate secular rulership and a separate religious rulership. Now, in theory, the monasteries were under the control of the bishops. The monasteries, and this is really still on this other point, this patriarch, this point two here. The monasteries often had almost independence, and in many very outlying regions, like northern Africa, for instance, the only actual authority that existed in some of these very distant provinces was the monasteries. They're really the only power, the only authority, the only economic authority as well were these monasteries, which had quite a bit of independence. Now, the most controversial thing that probably faced churches in this time period was the icon issue, the iconoclasm issue. There was a big to do about using icons in the Christian church, which is sort of forbidden by the Ten Commandments. You're not supposed to use images, any type of an image. But it really became common in the Christian church by this time period to have images, statues, imagery, pictures, paintings, um, sculptures, you name it. And people often thought these images, these items, these icons, had religious power, actually possessed holy power. This became very common for icons to be the focus of religious services, um, even to the point of believing like a religious icon which represented a very holy person, what we call a saint. Uh, Even believing the icon, you could actually communicate with the saint through some type of an image or some type of a piece of clothing, a bone, um, any type of a relic. We would usually call it a relic. You could actually communicate with the saint. And as a way of communicating with the saint, you could ask for personal gifts, personal prayers. And this became a real problem because many people in the church came to believe that folks were worshiping the icons and the saints and not worshiping God, which really upset a lot of people. Um, you see soldiers, especially soldiers who fought against the Muslims, really complaining about this, saying icons were bad because they would claim that like Muslims prohibited icons. For Muslims, the Islamic faith prohibited any type of imagery, which technically Christianity does too. But by this period of time, that had sort of been overlooked or gotten around by using different justifications. But the Islamic faith prohibited any type of icons or imagery like that. And many soldiers said that's why they were winning. The Muslims are beating us because they are maintaining faithful versus Christians that are really not being faithful to the commandments of God. That's why we're getting our ass kicked by the Muslims every day. And that's why the empire is collapsing. They're truly faithful to their God, and we're not. So with all this together, it really falls to Leo the Third in the 700s. Um, this was a real test of authority for the emperors, the Byzantine emperors, what to do with this. These icons were so intermediary for so many people. For so many folks, they considered icons to be the way to communicate and get spiritual blessings. That the emperor even went so far as to say they undermined his authority. They undermined imperial authority. Um, After all, if people are worshiping icons, they're not worshiping God, they're not worshiping the church, and the emperor considered himself divine, and the emperor was treated as divine, half human, half god. He ruled with a divine authority. The more common term we use is divine rule, the idea that kings and emperors have the blessing of God. Well, there you go. If you're worshiping the icons and the emperor and the soldiers are complaining that icons are bad, and you put all this together and it comes to a head under Emperor Leo III in the 700s, and this really has to do with a lot of attacks, constant attacks by the Arabs. Constantinople's attacked. Uh, it becomes a crisis, literally an uprising in Constantinople, to where people in Constantinople started tearing down every icon, every statue, every image of religious figures, um, tearing everything down, even tearing down imagery of Christ, tearing down crosses. The only thing, actually, to be more clear, about the only thing really left after they tore down all the icons were crosses. That's it. They left up some images of the cross. Everything else, they ripped off the walls. Everything else, they tore down. It became pretty intense. And a lot of really people were really upset by this and challenged by it. We see women going on a very famous rampage through Constantinople, which caused a massive amount of rioting in the streets. It was improper for women to be doing this, yet the women are doing it anyway because they believed women had to be kept out of the public and kept separate. All of this challenges the authority of the emperor. All of it put together, the emperor has to act. And the emperor does act. Leo bans all icons, orders them destroyed or banned. This becomes what we now call later the iconoclasm controversy. Bans or orders destroyed all icons. Iconoclasm stands for icon smashing. This ban forced all kinds of changes in how people worshipped, or if you wanted to continue using imagery or icons of any sort, you had to do it in private. Many people took their religious prayers and their religious services underground or had them in secret. Many people believed the only way they could actually have religious faith and have their faith actuated, meaning they would actually get a response or some type of action or actually get their prayers answered, was if they talked directly to religious figures, which would be the saints, for instance. It is note that one of the reasons Christianity does expand, one of the tactics used by Christianity is to take pagan icons and simply change them over to Christian icons. And this is one of the ways that allowed Christianity to expand and grow because pagans worshipped icons. And Christianity allows pagans to continue worshiping icons, only now they are Christian icons. This is one of the tactics used to help Christianity expand. Now, many people in Byzantium didn't want that anymore, didn't need it anymore. Iconoclasm also prompts attacks on monasteries because monasteries were often repositories of holy images, holy collections. They burn books, tear down, destroy paintings, destroy imagery, destroy statues, properties confiscated. Even monks who challenged this were forced to give up their monkhood. I'm not sure it's a real word, but I made it up. They were forced to give it up. They were forced to give up celibacy. They were forced to marry, which means they can no longer be part of church authority. Now, if they're no longer celibate, they're no longer, quote unquote, married to God or a servant of God. So, in this way, iconoclasm actually strengthens imperial authority because many communities that might have actually resisted the empire, resisted imperialism through some type of independence, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago with monasteries. Guess what? The monasteries are now shut down or controlled by the state. This actually strengthens imperial authority. It really does. Now, reorganized and reoriented, this actually increases the authority and increases the power of Byzantine to actually resist Muslims. I'm going to look at an image here. Icon of the Virgin, Mary, and Child. So we have Mary and Child in the middle. You can see the halos anywhere that time there's this circle around the head that indicates they're like a saint or they're holy of some sort. So you have these halos around their head. And you have soldier saints on either side. Pardon me, that's these two down here. Soldier saints on either side of Mary and Jesus here. And these in the back are angels. The beards are what's interesting. Anyone has a beard that indicates some type of a human form. So that indicates that they are humans, and angels are beardless, indicating they're not human. Really interesting imagery. So this is one of those icons that they would have had to destroy, tear down, burn. We believe a great deal of early Christian imagery was destroyed during the iconoclasm years. Iconoclasm was another incredible effect too. It actually ends up creating two separate Christian churches. This is one of the things that really helps create, it's one of the schisms is the term we use. It's one of the schisms between the Christian church, which actually creates an Eastern and a Western Christian church. The two major divisions, which don't become official yet, but even pretty much with the iconoclasm controversy, because all of this doesn't happen in Rome. The Catholic Church doesn't tear down all their icons and burn all the relics and tear down all that stuff. They don't do that. Catholic Christian Church based in Rome keeps right on trucking along with icons and imagery. They keep with that. They don't back away from it. While Byzantium and what we will start calling the Eastern Orthodox Church backs away from icons in this time period. This creates a huge rift in the church, even to the point of where both the Patriarch in Constantinople and the Pope in Rome both consider themselves the leader of the Christian church, simultaneous. Also in this time period, we end up with two emperors, an emperor in Europe, a Frankish emperor, and an emperor, of course, Constantinople. So we end up in the same general time period, two different emperors with two entirely different views of icons and two people who claim to both lead the Christian church. No wonder we end up with basically a split Christian church that are pulling apart and in 200 years completely separate. But it's really in the making right now in this time period. Now we're going to switch to the Franks. We're going to talk about Europe a little bit. These are the inheritors of the Roman Empire in the West, or Europe. So during the 6th century, the Franks established themselves as the dominant power in Gaul. Gaul is sort of that region of modern day France and Spain, more France, but also going into Spain as well. They established themselves as a dominant barbarian tribe. This is what the Romans would have called them, barbarians. Um, the kings who rise to power are what we call the Merovingians. Every time I say that, I think of the Matrix. You know, the Merovingian, the Matrix. Really, really interesting. One of my favorite series, trilogies of all time. Just had to interject that. Wait till I start using Star Trek references. That may happen. So anyway, the Merovingians founded their kingdom on territory that was still dotted with Roman villas, Roman farmland, Roman roads. They considered themselves, they didn't call themselves Romans, not really. Eventually, they'll call themselves the Holy Roman Empire, but that's still a little ways off. But in this point in time, they were the Franks, but they're really taking over what had been the Roman Empire, or a big chunk of it in Europe anyway. And the kings were the Merovingians. So the Franks are the people, yet the Merovingian is the ruling family. Make sure you understand the difference. All right, so the Roman cities were losing their commercial cultural vitality. The cities were starting to depopulate. Grounding, basically, the surrounding forests and pasture land turn into farming villages. Much of what I've talked about in Constantinople starts to happen here too. The cities start to empty out and depopulate. They start to fall apart. Nobody repairs them. And Europe moves to a more agricultural, agrarian lifestyle of smaller populations, more spread out, and more agriculturally organized. Similar, similar to sort of what we saw in Byzantium. We still have slaves. Slavery is still a common thing in Southern Europe. Generally, Southern Europe. We don't see as much in North. But the closer you are to Italy, you still see slavery sort of as a leftover of the Roman Empire. Um, we do start to see more wealthy part. We see the slaves working on wealthy farms, wealthy. We won't use the word plantation, although by our modern vernacular, it basically is what it was. They were large farm plantations, these large these large farms. We do have free peasants, free farmers. Most people are still semi-free in this time period. The small farms, so the large ones we may call estate. A large farm would be an estate or a lord's manor, the lord's manor on the estate. The small ones are the manses. These are like small independent farms, which might probably include a little farm, a little house, maybe a little garden. Why the difference between a farm and a garden? Well, the garden was for the actual fruits and vegetables your family ate. The farm was to sell. The agriculture you produced on the farm was a cash crop. That's how you paid your bills. That's how you paid your taxes. Either you paid it in food or you paid it in the money you made from market. So your farm was used to support you economically. The garden is what you fed your family, your fruits and vegetables, your much smaller little plot of land. So yeah, when you see farmers working all the farms in medieval ages, 90% of all the stuff they're out there working, it doesn't they don't eat that. They don't make clothes out of it. They don't live on it. It is for economic sustenance. So these peasants, some who using the old term, I don't guess I have it on the slide. The old term of these peasants from Roman times would have been called coloni, Coloni. These are the old peasant colonies. We do in this time period really start calling them peasants, poor farmers. They owed either duty or food to work the land. So they either had to pay agricultural products, or they did have to pay labor, or if they did generate money by selling their goods at market, they had to pay taxes. So whether it's labor, food, or actual money, most likely the first two, they had to pay to the large landowners, the large farmers, the elites, if you will. The 5% at the top. Now, the really richest people, these aristocrats, even if they had a farm, they probably still lived in the local village or town. They lived in these villages surrounded by huts full of peasants, shepherds, artisans, small, regular, common people. This is the early medieval village. That's really what it is. The early medieval village. It is all pretty much characterized, and this becomes standard for about 1,000 years, all the way to almost modern times. Last basically the era of colonization, the last couple of centuries, to where you have one large city, then all the other towns for miles and miles around are small little villages, and this is where most people live in these small local villages, usually clustered around a protector, maybe a castle or a lord, something like that. Very interesting. Very interesting society. Um, that is interesting. My notes are kind of weird there. All right. There was a very strong religious belief in the idea of saints and relics, which I sort of touched on a minute ago. But the power of a saint and the power of relics, which were often housed in the local, excuse me, often housed in the local church or the local cathedral. Um, they thought that these relics could protect, they could heal. This creates a new relationship between the living and the dead. It really does. Um, in the ancient pagan world, they didn't want dead people around. Dead people were banished. Dead people were thought to be. Dead people brought evil. They brought curses, spirits, ghosts, think of that kind of stuff. Bad stuff. Dead people equals bad stuff. So if you see dead people, well, you're cursed. Well, in the Christian medieval ages, they come to start revering ghosts and spirits. There are still bad ghosts and spirits, but the church can take care of that too through exorcism. So you want good ghosts and spirits, you want presence of the dead, but the holy dead. So many of these small towns and villages would have a church or a cathedral that often would have a relic, or they would worship a particular saint. So as you can see, with iconoclasm in the Byzantine world was a big problem. Iconoclasm and revering saints and relics was part and parcel of the Catholic Church. It was core to the Catholic Church. What do we have here? We have the Merovingian kingdoms, the 7th century. If you're at all familiar with the map and geography, this is basically France today. This is almost entirely France, this entire region right through here. And then you get over to Germany over here. And of course, today you have here in the middle, you have Belgium in this region in here. Um, but this gives you an idea of some of these different barbarian kingdoms, the Lombards, the Visigoths, and yes, the Franks were a barbarian tribe as well, until they settled down and started building cities and living as the sort of the successors to the Romans. Everybody's a barbarian until they start building cities and get culture, then they're a civilization. Um, So we have that. This is a good image here. The Porta Nigra at Trier. This is the Porta Nigra at Trier. This is a large Roman gate, more commonly called the Black Gate in France. Much of it's really weird. Rome has collapsed, but all of the architecture of Rome still exists. The statues, the gates, the roads, the huge stone structures, the buildings, all of it still remains. Much of it in disrepair. They don't have the money or resources or desire to keep it in good condition anymore, but the stuff is still there. I mean, today, what, 1,300 years later, you can still travel all over Europe and see imagery. You can see remainders of the Roman Empire, things that were built 2,000 years ago, still standing. So this really sort of a testament to the loss of Roman culture and the loss of a vanishing civilization. Eventually, they actually take this, and what happened is this was supposed to be a massive gate for a wall, but Rome fell. They never built the wall. The wall was never completed. Parts of it, but was never really done. So they built the gate. It would be like building a doorway and then forgetting to build the house. It's really weird. So you had the gate, but you didn't really have walls or anything or walls to go with it. But the gate itself was a very impressive structure. Eventually, a monk moves in and turns it into sort of a quasi monastery, monk slash hermit. This is where a religious person sort of goes off by themselves and lives in isolation. So a monk slash hermit. Eventually, it is made into a church and even sanctified. Sanctification is where you turn a structure or something into a holy site. This is turned into a church and a holy site eventually. And originally it was just a gate for a wall. Really interesting thing how things change over time and how culture and ideas change over time. It's really pretty though. Um, let's see what else. Here we have the map of Tours around 600. This shows how much religion had taken over European society. Look how many churches there are. This is not a major city. I mean, it's not a small town. It's a decent sized town, but still, look at them everywhere. Church, 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 church. We could go on. Lots of churches. With these zones of pilgrimage, this becomes a major religious site. Wherever the churches are, you have cemeteries. It's really interesting. The bishop had a palace here, so this became a center of religious observance. Religious pilgrimages and religious trade, sort of like we talked about with Mecca. It's almost a tourist attraction or a tourist revenue. They would not have classified it that way or looked at it that way necessarily. The business people did, though. All those people coming, all those people traveling, all those people coming to see relics and religious sites and pray or see the bishops or get their prayers answered or whatever to get cured or because people come here who were sick expecting healing, religious healing. They also lived there or rented there. They bought food there. They stayed overnight. They shopped there. Religion was a major source of revenue. Very interesting. All right, economic activity in a peasant society. All right, so by the 700s, Europe has become a peasant society. Southern and Western Europe, what we think of as like Germany, France, Italy, has really become this peasant society. Most people live on the edge of survival, subsistence. Literally, people live day to day just getting enough food and calories to survive. We see a dramatic drop in life expectancy. We see a dramatic drop in temperature. We see a dramatic drop in food output. We see reduced crop yields. We see shortages. We see famines. This is the Dark Ages, where we lose much of what was civilization culturally, economically, educationally, technologically. People stop putting glass in windows. People stop having windows. People start sleeping with their animals to stay warm. They don't sleep with their animals because they like sleeping next to a smelly, like shit cow. They sleep next to their animals because they're freezing, and the animal's body heat is keeping them warm at night. One of the reasons disease spreads so well. But we'll talk about that. Uh, Basically, life in these dark ages from the 500s, 600s to the 800s, 900s is tough. A subsistence and a gift economy, to where the rich and wealthy people really gave gifts to the poor. They gave them food, they gave them property, to get them to obey, to get them to follow them, to get them to do what they wanted them to do. And of course, it also keeps the poor from basically raiding your farm and taking everything you've got. You pay them off, and they'll also start to follow you, be loyal to you as well. This is really the beginning of this feudal society. The upper class of the landowning warriors and churchmen, they lived off the work of the peasants, and when there was a surplus, they would give out these gifts. Of course, they would constant warfare. The Franks were constantly at war, so European society was through constant warfare. That's another reason you needed the peasants. You needed warriors, and you would provide land or food or things to the warriors if they worked and fought for you. So anytime they did conquer an enemy, they would take their treasure, their wealth. They would hoard the wealth. The rich and wealthy, the landowners and the warriors would hoard the wealth. And then in times of trouble or when they thought the peasants were going to rise up, they would divvy out the treasure. They would suddenly, oh my gosh, suddenly we have a surplus of food. Let's give out food to everybody to keep them happy so they don't burn down our house and kill everybody. It happened a lot. Those that power and status had lots of wealth, lots of power, lots of money. Religious people in monasteries also benefited greatly from this. Matter of fact, by the 800s, the richest institution in Europe, hands down, was the Catholic Church. Between the churches and the monasteries, the most money, the most resources, the most land, the most wealth, the most power was probably in the hands of the Christian Church. almost unassailable power and status. Everybody in Europe wanted to be friends with the Catholic Church because they had so much power and wealth. And of course, they're the only ones who could save your soul. They're the only ones who could offer salvation for the heaven, for the afterlife. And religious sites, of course, became centers of wealth and power. We do see trade continue on, trade of furs, slaves, honey, weapons, silk, papyrus, and many other luxuries. Trade does continue, and trade is, of course, a big way of making money. Jews were integrated into all aspects of European society. Judaism was still practiced all through Europe, and Jews were all through Europe, and they were often involved in trade, often involved in business ventures. Some were quite rich, some were quite poor. There's a often a misconception that Jews had all the money, Jews were all the bankers, Jews were rich, while Christians, no, that's not true. There was wealthy Christians, wealthy Jews, poor Jews. Um, you know, it was pretty equal opportunity exploitation really by the upper classes, regardless of your religious faith. Um, we see Jews that were still, though we do see some interesting things here. Jews are still often segregated. They often have to live in their own communities, their own what they would call like a Jewish quarter in a town. Jews were never really trusted. Although we don't see rampant persecution under the Franks, Jews are still looked at suspiciously by many Christians. Powerful in Merovingian society, monarchs and aristocrats held the power through hereditary wealth, status, political influence. These were the rich, the wealthy. Many aristocrats lived a very abundant life with lots of money, lots of status. These are the ones that eventually become the nobles, the kings, the queens, the lords, the dukes, the duchesses, all of those titles. They spend most of their time in this time period training to be warriors and developing uh, virtues to lead men in battle. This was one of the things about status in this time period. You were expected to be a knight, a warrior, uh, your martial skill. Where does that come from? Because they were all barbarians. It just in the previous time, right before this, the only way you had status among the barbarian tribes was through martial prowess. That is, your ability to fight. Um, and therefore, that is still a way of life. To where those that are elite and powerful must also have the ability to fight and wage war. Children was really important. You needed kids. You needed to have as many kids as possible. You always had to have an heir. You always had to have someone to pass on your status, your money, your wealth to. Very important. Critical to the survival of the aristocrats. You have to be able to spread the wealth among your family line. Marriage was expensive, but I mean, there was cheaper versions of marriage. But marriage among the aristocrats, you often had to give a big share of your wealth to the new family, your daughter and your new son-in-law. Still didn't really appreciate having women. It was still common to expose infant girls. That means they would just take them out into the woods, or they would drop them off at a church or monastery, and they would then be an orphan. Um, because having daughters and marrying them off was expensive. The tradition required you to give them the dowry, a significant chunk of your wealth. We see him moving to a Christian education. I think I mentioned that already. We see him moving away from a secular education to a Christian education, just like in Byzantium. Bishops often ranked as the most powerful men in many parts of society. They were also usually aristocrats. The bishops usually were one of these rich landowners. That's one of the ways you got a bishopric. That is where you were given the title of bishop, almost like a job title. A little different than today, but back then it was, yeah, it was like a career to get this bishop position. Gregory of Tours, for instance, is an example. Many people consider themselves to be protectors of the citizens. Gregory of Tours was one, and he even he expected the priests and the bishops to set good moral examples. Today, we think of that as standard. Our religious leaders are supposed to set good moral examples for us. They're supposed to be sort of a moral guidepost for society. As I said, back then, many people in the church, it was a business. It was really a business venture. It wasn't about being a moral leader. Gregory of Tours was different. He believed they needed to do this moral leadership. Aristocratic women. They determined who the daughters would marry. Marriage bound together entire families, and of course, marriage was expensive due to the reasons I already mentioned. If a wife was married, she actually could control her dowry. She might have some authority over her dowry. She could sell it, give it away. She could rent out the property. If she was widowed, women had a decent amount of authority in this time period under the Frankish Empire, under the Frankish dynasty. A woman could also choose to join the church. Limited authority. If a woman did choose to join and have any authority, it was almost only in like a convent or a nunnery. Although we do have a handful of places where we actually have abbesses. An abbess is in a monastery over men. So you have monks and an actual woman in charge of the monastery. That is unusual, but we see that in Christian monasteries occasionally. A male would be an abbot, and then a woman's an abbess. We see that happening. It's interesting how women would do this. So women could actually have some control over their property, their legal rights, some authority. They could actually have some roles in the Christian church. Really interesting how this might happen. Not common though. Most women were subservient or required to be subservient and obedient to husbands or fathers and to take a very second class role in society, usually. The power of the king. The Merovingian kings often allied themselves with local aristocrats, local governors, and their wealth really came from plunder. That's where you defeat your enemies and take their stuff. You take their booty. Yes, that's a term, a sort of a pirate term. You take their booty from them. Also, the taxes. They made a lot of money or wealth from taxes, fines. The legal system was pretty extensive. There was lots of rules and laws, and people broke them all the time because most people were illiterate. How do you know the laws if you're illiterate? Well, we'll just fine you, and there you go. You could even fines and breaking the law could get you put into slavery. That could even happen. All of this was based upon the Roman systems. All this was really based upon what the Romans had done. Now the court. This is all the official people around the king. All like think of like all the people working in and around the palace. So all the official people around the king is his court. It functioned as a school for sons. The aristocratic sons would get training, usually from other educated people in the court. They would get maybe like tutors or something like that. Um, this certainly strengthened the bond between the king and all of his lords. This reciprocal relationship where the lords would fight and defend the king, and the king would give protection and money and education to the lords. So we see this reciprocal relationship. Um, Basically, these people ruled all over the empire in the name of the king, whether it's a count, a duke, a lord, whatever the different title was. They all supposedly had the power of the king wherever they ruled, due to their relationship to the court. Even to the point where some kings actually kept members of different aristocrats' families and expected them to keep members of the family at the court, almost like a way of controlling them. Hey, if you don't do what I say, I've got your cousin or your niece or your nephew here. You never know. They might just end up dead if you don't obey me. So it was almost like a form of, I don't know what you want to call it, kidnapping almost, almost a form of kidnapping and coercion. This was not necessarily, not all kings did that, but some kings did. The king gave great power, great authority, and maybe one of the most powerful people in the entire king's palace was the mayor of the palace. The mayor of the palace was the behind the scenes person who really ran the palace. King's the king, who runs everything, supposedly. But who actually runs the day to day duties? Who actually is the administrative leader? That's the mayor of the palace. Like today, look at modern England. You have a Queen of England, but who actually runs England? The Prime Minister runs England. That's the actual president of England, is the Prime Minister. Well, same thing here. You have a king, but who actually runs the administrative day to day duties of the entire empire? The mayor of the palace. Well, why is this really significant? Because the mayor of palace The family who were the mayors of the palace, the family line, were the Carolingian. They were the Carolingian aristocrats. Eventually, they actually kill the Merovingians and take over. So they no longer are happy being behind the scenes. They eventually overthrow the Merovingians and they take over the Frankish Empire, the Frankish kingdom. Still Frankish kingdom, but now the Carolingians take over. And they were in prime position because they already ran everything. So they simply overthrew the Merovingians and took over. Not surprising. The fact that it lasted for so long before they did, it was many, many years before the Carolingians finally overthrew the Merovingians. Maybe they just needed to bide their time to gain wealth and status and power. And once they did, they took over. All right, so we're getting close to the end of this. Let's look at Christianity and classical culture in the British Isles. All right, so this is one we haven't even really talked about. This is England. Now, this was part of Rome. England was Britain, part of the Roman Empire, that very northern part, all the way up there. The island off the north coast. England settled into about a dozen different pagan kingdoms, ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings. Anglo-Saxon kings are the ones that ruled all these different kingdoms. This is after the fall of Rome. Pretty much a bunch of little independent tribes, independent barbarian tribes. Now, let's say it differently. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, the Christians, before we really are calling it the Catholic Church, they had gone up and tried to Christianize the Britons when they were part of the Roman Empire. And they did this with monasteries. They established monasteries all across the British Isles, and they did this with the sole purpose of Christianizing and, of course, spreading Roman culture. This is after Rome converts over to Christianity. And they want to spread the culture and also the religious belief. Irish monks were probably the most notable in this time period, that they were probably the most prominent, most well known, and the most dedicated. Even after Rome falls, you still have Irish monks trying to spread Christianity across the British Isles, which were all pretty much pagan beliefs. St. Patrick is an interesting one. Has absolutely nothing to do with the holiday. Nothing. There's nothing to do with green beer or parties. Oh my gosh. I've read about St. Patrick and St. Patrick's Day. There's literally no connection. It baffles me actually. Anyway, these Irish monasteries were organized around very traditional rural clans. Basically, the rural families would be in the surrounding farmlands around the monasteries. And after Rome sort of retracts in upon itself and starts to collapse, the people running the monasteries are the local lords. If they had converted to Christianity, they kept it as Christian, although it does become sort of a different version of Christianity. These communities usually involved relatives, servants, slaves, monks, nuns, and they were often led by an abbot. So we find many small towns and farms led by the monasteries. This is one of those sort of independent regions that was away from the center of religious life. Of course, you got to consider England is, good Lord, 2,000, 3,000 miles away from Rome. So it is the other side of the world, effectively. Almost no one in the world would have been able to travel between England and Rome. It would have been a handful of people in this entire time period. So really, the church authority, where Christianity had taken hold, was really the dominant power in these regions. And they worked sort of hand in hand with the local tribes and the local barbarian families, the local um, sort of the local clans, I guess, is the word they would use in this time period. Christianity exists. We see these Roman practices of Christianity very much in challenge with Irish idea of Christianity. Um, this new version of Christianity, which comes in after the 700s, is entirely different. You have to understand the first Christians to get there in the 300-400s and built these monasteries, then Rome collapses. There is really no communication with Italy and the Rome, the heart of Catholic faith, for 250 years. You have Christianity growing entirely separate, a total separate direction of Christianity in Ireland and England versus what we see developing in Rome. And then 250 years later, they come back together and they clash. Very different views of how Christianity is supposed to be and the way Christianity works, different practices, very much at odds. Um, when the Catholic bishops show up, they start dividing the entire British Isles into different dioceses. These are different counties basically, and the dioceses are in charge of each one is put a Catholic or a Catholic bishop or archbishop. So we get the new Catholic religion trying to dominate the old Irish Christian religion, which also results in bloodshed and violence and warfare over this. Now, you might say it's over religion. It's not exactly. It's also over political power and control. So we see Roman churches and Irish churches disagreeing, challenging each other, and actually leading to violence in many cases. They disagreed on Easter, for instance. They disagreed on the date of Easter. In 664, they put this, along with other issues, to a council, basically a religious council, known as a synod. And they have this religious council in 644, the Synod of Whitby, and it's mainly church people in attendance. And they convince Rome. They were finally convinced that Rome had the authority of Saint Peter, and they do finally start to agree that Roman Christianity is dominant over Irish Christianity for one reason: the idea of Peter being the very first pope, the very first. It's what we know as the Petrine doctrine, that the very first bishop of the Christian faith was Peter. Um, and Jesus said something to the effect of the rock of the church was Peter, and the church will be built on Peter's faith. And so once they accepted that this is really sort of the scripture, and since Peter was based in Rome, they do finally come to agree that, well, I guess that makes sense. I suppose that means that the Christian faith from Rome is the one we should follow. We have been separated for 200 years and we have gotten off. We have basically diverted from the true scriptures, and we should try and bring ourselves back to what is the proper Christian faith. Tried to do this. They really came to believe that Rome was the center of Christian faith. Rome was considered by many English people to be the center of knowledge, the center of holy objects, and it really does come to believe that Rome is the center of the Christian faith. Benedict Bishop in the 630s, I believe he was alive from around 630 to 690. So from 630 to 690, he founded a couple of monasteries. This was in the British Isles. He traveled to Rome. He brought back relics and books. He brought back almost enough books for a whole library. This is how the Catholic faith spread into Northern Europe and really becomes foundational in Northern Europe, and how the old Christians convert to the new Christians, and how Christianity really. This really becomes Roman Christianity, and this is really where we'll start referring to it as the Catholic faith. We now take most Europeans that are now following this Christian Orthodox religion, meaning the traditional foundational religion, this Orthodox religion, and this is just one example in England, but most other regions in Europe start to come to accept that the only real true Christianity, the real true doctrine, is doctrine that comes out of Rome. And that is the only doctrine that can be trusted. That is the true Orthodox doctrine. They base this on written text. They base this on tradition, written text, on preaching. And these monasteries eventually become centers of learning and education. Matter of fact, in Ireland and England, about the only place you can get an official education in this time period is a monastery. That's about it. About the only place you can do it. Nonetheless, we get a vigorous oral tradition, a literary culture, which does survive in England. Shakespeare should be thankful to this, even though Shakespeare is way past this. This culture of literary and writing and fictional writing. If you go to Rome, almost everything that's written is religious, nonfiction. You go to England, you actually have a large narrative, sort of poetry and stories, a sort of this literary fictional culture, which really becomes interesting. A very important scholar was the Venerable Bede. He was from 670s to the 730s. He wrote in well, we would use the term English today, but at the time they would have called it Anglo-Saxon. He wrote in this Anglo-Saxon language, which eventually is what becomes English. Rarely written. Almost no one wrote in that language. Very, very rarely did anyone write in that language. And eventually the English church is directly tied to the Roman church. There's Whitby right there, England, Kent, Canterbury, Ireland, Scotland. I almost went to an English accent there for a minute, didn't I? I certainly did. Let's see what I talk about here. Briefly talk about Spain. Who was the king in Spain? Leovigild, under the Visigoths. They were Arian Christians. That's a different type of Christianity. Arian Christians in Spain. This is short-lived because pretty soon the Muslims come in and take over Spain. Recared converts to Roman Catholic in 587. And eventually most Arians convert. And eventually by the 600s, Arian faith, and really the biggest thing about Arian faith, it's Christian, is they don't believe that they believe Jesus was a man, not of God. They didn't believe Jesus was in any way religious. He was just a guy who spoke to God or spoke to angels. He was delivering God's message. So this idea of him being of God and eternal, which is standard in most Christian faiths and the Catholic Church, Arians didn't believe that. So eventually we do see the Arian faith supplanted here by the Catholic Christian faith. We see the entire hierarchy of Visigothic Spain really come to follow Catholic Christian faith. And all this is really how Christianity spreads across Europe and comes to dominate all these different regions. They believed that the king was equal to the priests. They believed that the religious and secular authority was generally equal. Even to the point of saying to rebel against the king will be to rebel against God. That God and the king are, we're not going to say synonymous, but this is an aspect of what we'll start to call divine rule. The idea that the kings rule with the agreement of God, with the blessing of God. Divine rule is what we'll call it. This helps really centralize the power of the Visigoths. However, this also results in the undoing of the Visigoths. Because when the Arabs arrive in 711, the Muslim Arabs arrive in 711 into Spain, all they had to defeat was one single army. Instead of a bunch of little kingdoms and lords, they defeated one large army, the Visigothic army, and in one fell blow, they conquered the entirety of Spain. Spain collapsed. In less than about 2 years, the Muslims conquered almost the entire peninsula. I believe I don't have it in my notes, but I think it's the Iberian Peninsula is what we call it. They conquered that entire peninsula, which today is 2 countries, Spain and Portugal, and they did it in just a couple of years. Incredibly easy. Interesting how quickly it happened and how quickly Spain fell to the Muslims. Unification actually brought downfall from them, and I don't think they expected it. One of the reasons Islam grew and expanded so quickly is no one expected it. It just happened, and it happened fast. In Italy, we had the Lombard king. Lombard was the barbarian tribe there. He faces a very hostile Christian rule in Rome because Rome wants independence and freedom, and the Lombards want to dominate Rome as they dominate everywhere. I mean, Christianity was so powerful, maybe the most powerful institution in Europe. If you could control the seat of Christian faith, that would give you incredible power and prestige, to where you control what is probably the single most powerful authority in Europe, and you would have authority over it. That makes you the most powerful authority in Europe. So Lombards constantly tried to dominate and control the Christian seat of power in Rome. it was a back and forth. It was a constant power struggle between the Lombards and the Italian rulers and the Catholic Christian rulers. They established a capital at Pavia. They built churches, monasteries. They mint their own coins. They create their own little empire, the Lombard Empire, which is pretty much just Italy or northern Italy. But they were constantly at odds with the Catholic Church in Italy. Never fully united, and as soon as the Lombards start to run into problems, because on the southeast corner of the Lombards, they start having to deal with Muslim incursions, and of course, incursions from other barbarian tribes, who do the Lombards go asking for help? They go to the Franks, and they ask the Franks for assistance. I'll get to that in a second. Here we have the Iberian Peninsula. You can see this entire region. When it was all united, with the capital here, then the Muslims cross across the Strait of, I think it's the Strait of Gibraltar, from northern Africa into Spain. They quickly capture Spain, all the way up here to the mountains, separating what becomes France and Spain. Pretty quick. They fell very quickly. Here we have Lombards, the capital at Pavia, and the Byzantine Empire. So we have multiple claims on Rome. We have the Catholic Church claiming Rome, we have the Byzantine Empire claiming Rome, and we have the Lombards claiming Rome and the surrounding territories. Well, the more and more the Lombards get pressure from other barbarian tribes, from Muslims, from the Byzantine Empire, the Lombards have to respond. And they look to their big brother neighbor, the Franks, who are up here. And they ask the Franks to help them, and we end up getting this sort of this alliance between the Lombards, the Franks, and the Catholic Church, all working together for a common goal of independence and power in Europe. So by 600, the Pope was both the authority over the Christian Church, but technically subservient, or I guess subordinate might be a better word, subordinate to the Lombard kings. Now, Pope Gregory the Great in the late 500s, he really establishes many of these guidelines of how the church is going to run and how it's going to work. Well, he wields great authority because he takes on the secular role of King of Rome. Yes, of Rome, like just the little province of Rome, the city and the surrounding. It's really what we think of as like a Greek city-state. So it's the city and the surrounding lands. He doesn't proclaim himself king, but effectively he is. He's a leader of the church, and he's also the de facto king of the province of Rome. Um, he pays for an army. He raises an army. He collects taxes. He hears court cases. He makes treaties. He runs the entire government, religious and secular, for several years. Very interesting. He sends missionaries to England. He's the one who sent Christian missionaries to Spain. He converts the Visigoths to Christianity. He's the one that helps get the missionaries convert the Irish and the British to Christianity. There's a reason he's called the Great. He is one of the most influential popes in the Catholic faith. He did so many things to really shape Catholic Christianity in this time period. Um, he was sort of, even though Peter might have been the one the church was based upon the time of Christ, in this this period of time and change and transition, the church was really sort of founded on him. The new modern Catholic Church, for the 600s, modern, this idea of what it was really based on. Um, he writes books, he writes commentaries, he writes scriptures. His handbook for the clergy, known as Pastoral Rule, this pretty much becomes the guidebook for the church, and he is the one who really pushes the idea of celibacy, that you should be married to God and married to the church and not have a wife and not have children, or in the case of a woman, not have a husband, whichever, being celibate. Um, so he was this bishop in the Roman Empire, and at this point in time, technically, Rome was part of Byzantium. Even though surrounded by Lombards, technically it was part of Byzantium, which is way the hell over here. So he actually He was ruled locally. It's really strange. He ruled his own little province of Rome, but he was technically beholden to the Lombards who ruled all the surrounding land, but he was officially under the rulership of Byzantium's emperor. Really, we would say an untenable position. Talk about having multiple masters. And somehow you have to try and make all of them happy all the time, and somehow walk these multiple lines between keeping everybody from being pissed off at you. And not to mention, then you have to worry about all your religious importance and all the importance of keeping religious faith. Tough line to walk, I'm sure. Um, so subordinate and to all these different things. This rift continues to widen further and further, continues to be a challenge. Then Emperor Leo III from Byzantium, he tries to increase taxes. He tries to actually make it official that he has total authority over Rome, while the Lombards want to say they have authority over Rome. Well, the Pope realizes he has to choose a side. The popes in Rome realize they can no longer just rule their own little territory, this little state of Rome, and what we sometimes think of as like the papacy. They can't just rule that. Eventually, they have to figure out who are they going to side themselves with? Whose side are they going to choose? Byzantium, the emperor on the other side of the water over there, or are they going to go ahead and side with the Lombards and the Franks, who are the ones that are nearby? Because the Pope could not stand alone. Even though he organized his own military, it would have not been in any way able to challenge a Lombardy army or a Frankish army or a Byzantine army. So he had to choose someone to really put his allegiance and loyalty with. Further, you add of this that Leo had his ban on the icons. This is the Leo of the whole iconoclasm controversy. All of this increasing friction and all increasing problems. What does the Pope do? He does something very unexpected. The Pope at the time, instead of okay, I'll say this. Had the Lombards not really succumbed to the Franks sort of take over the Lombard territory. Had that not happened, the Pope would have probably thrown in with the Lombards. But around the same time all this is happening, the Lombards start to be dominated by the Franks, and they're also losing territory to the Byzantines, and the Lombards just sort of fade away. And in their place come the Franks and the Byzantines. And the Pope decides to side with the Franks. And by joining with the Franks, you have the most powerful institution in Europe, the Catholic Church, siding with the most powerful secular institution in Europe, the most powerful kingdom, the Frankish kingdom, and eventually this leads us to the creation of the Holy Roman Empire in Europe. And they separate themselves from Byzantium. He chooses sides. He chooses the most probably logical one, the kingdom which is right there. The Franks were just right there. And this really creates it's another piece of this schism, this permanent hold, this permanent schism between the two churches. Even though you had the iconoclasm controversy, you had the idea that you have two leaders of the church and two emperors. Um, Still, the Catholic Church was technically under the authority of Byzantium. Well, once the Pope decided, he publicly announces he's going to ally himself, he's going to make an allegiance and work with the Frankish emperor, the Frankish king, that even wider splits the two churches and the East and the West. They never come back together. From this point on, from the 750s on, the Western Roman world is forever separate from the Eastern Roman world. Byzantium never gains control or authority over Rome or Italy or any parts of Europe again. And that is where we're going to end this chapter, long chapter. But honestly, it's still not that long. If you think about it, in a class, we would have been in class for almost 3 hours. So it's still 2 hours and 5 minutes. That's a lot better than 3. And the good part is you can stop it, you can pause it, and you can drink a beer if you're old enough while you're watching. Something you can't do in class. Well, unless you got one of those containers and I can't tell. Never know. Um, Anyways, gives you an idea here of what we're looking at. The Muslim world, the Islamic world, the Frankish Empire up here, which is mostly this. Um, and of course, Rome finally choosing to side with the Franks. So Rome goes to Europe, and then Constantinople continues to contract and get smaller and smaller. And Constantinople remains this size for about 700 years. Never really, ever really gets any of that land back. It remains this small state. Anyway, till next time, peace out.